Alright, yeah, welcome back to some more Magic Arena, and this week we're going to be taking a look at a Red-White Legends deck. You could also call this one Squee Blade as well, because it is kind of the more powerful combo in the deck. So, Legends, how is this going to work? We want to play a lot of legendary creatures. The primary creature we're playing is Squee the Immortal. 1 double red for a 2/1 legendary creature. It says you may cast Squee the Immortal from your graveyard or from exile. So if your opponent seals it away, you can cast it from underneath the seal away. If they Vraska's Contempt it, you can cast it from exile. If it dies anyway through combat damage or anything like that, you can cast it from your graveyard. The only exception to this is due to a recent rules change, you cannot cast it underneath an Ixalan's Binding, which makes Ixalan's Binding the single spell in Magic the Gathering that can deal with Squee the Immortal. So other than that, he's coming back. So, what do you do with an unkillable legend? Well, you use him to exploit a few things. So, one of the things that came out of Dominaria was legendary sorceries, and they said that you could cast a legendary sorcery only if you can't control a legendary creature or planeswalker. So, they have some pretty powerful effects. However, the downside is that you need to actually have a board presence in order to use them. And most people, if they know that you're running things like Urza's Ruinous Blast in this case, or Jaya's Immolating Inferno, what they'll do is they'll just remove your legendary creature or planeswalker from the field as soon as humanly possible, so that these are dead cards in your hand. The upside is we have Squee, who is very, very difficult to remove. So it basically guarantees that these legendary sorceries are going to be online throughout the entire game, just so long as we find a Squee. So in addition to the legendaries, because we can't just Squee alone, because we don't really want to have 4 copies in here being legendary. You don't want 4 legendaries most of the time anyway. There might be a few exceptions in here. I'm yet to perfectly tweak this deck. I think it could probably be moved around a little bit, piece here and there, but for the most part I'm quite happy with what I've got here. But in addition to the legendary Squeeze that we've got, the only one that matters, we also have Captain Lannery Storm, a 3-mana 2/2 with haste legendary. There are no non-legendary creatures in this deck, I should mention that, just so I don't have to bring it up every time. Lannery Storm allows you to attack and create treasure tokens, and the real powerhouse of Lannery Storm here is that she actually, you may notice that we have some legendaries in 5 and things like that, some really important stuff to do there. Lannery Storm, when she attacks on 3, she will generate you a treasure that can add mana to your mana pool, which basically means if you make a land drop or attack in with Lannery the following turn, you have 5 mana to spend on whatever you like. So it really just helps out and smooths the deck out, allowing you to play things like Lyra, Urza's Ruinous Blast, or maybe a more powerful Jaya's Immolating Inferno very early on. So Lannery Storm, super powerful. She also combos very well with treasure maps as well. Treasure maps are one of our forms of card advantage. The artifact side is 2 mana, says pay 1 to tap it, scry 1, so we can set up our draws in the early game. Really, really useful. So, you basically tap it and scry, and you put a landmark counter on it, and when you have 3 or more landmark counters, you flip it over into Treasure Cove, and it generates 3 colourless treasure artifact tokens that can be added for mana. So, yet again, Treasure Map is mana ramp that allows us to get into our 5 mana spells, but we can also use it to either pay for a colourless, so it's effectively a nice land, or we can tap it to sacrifice a treasure, which is the primary focus of Treasure Cove, to draw a card. Now, Captain Lannery Storm, generating treasures, basically turns her into something like an Arch of Araska at that point, or even the Immortal Sun, because we'll be drawing 2 additional cards a turn, just so long as we can get in damage with Lannery Storm. Next we have Danitha, Capuchin Paragon, 2 and a white for a first striking, vigilant, life-linking 2/2, and she makes aura and equipment spells cost 1 less to cast. So she is kind of a stat soup, which is absolutely wonderful, and she makes equipment spells cost less. And which equipment does that apply to? Black Blade Reforged. This card is amazing. 2 mana for a legendary artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each land you control. So, on turn 4, when you're likely to be equipping it, you're probably going to be getting a +4/+4 for Black Blade for just a 3 equip cost there. Because we have legendary creatures and no non-legendaries, the equipped legendary creature there is the only one that's going to apply to us. So we can basically give something +4/+4 and swing through. Now if it's Danitha, that turns her into a turn 4 6/6 first striking vigilant lifelinker ready to attack. Lannery Storm does the same. She generates some treasures though while she does it, so we're allowed to safely ramp and attack through our opponent's creatures. But also, the primary focus, the main one, is Squee the Immortal, coming back to you again. You will find that I will win with this card more than any other legend, which makes it hilarious. I love this deck for that reason alone. Beating people with Squee is just, it's meme tier, god tier, beautiful plays. So, as we mentioned, Squee is insanely difficult to remove. Now, if you had a Black Blade Reforged that resolved on turn 2, which is quite likely, because other than something like a Duress or your opponent being on the play with a negate, Black Blade is coming down if you have it in your hand. So, if we have Black Blade in play, what we can do is we can equip it to Squee, and as we mentioned, we can give them +4 whatever, which turns Squee into a really, really big threat. So things that are burn related, they're not going to kill our opponent. Minus related, they're probably not going to kill Squee either. You can exile Squee, but then we'll just bring him back and equip him. So essentially, Squee becomes a 6 mana, very, very, very threatening creature, essentially. If we're paying 6 mana, we've probably got a +6/+6 on the Black Blade, which turns him into an 8/7 that comes back every single turn and cannot be killed. So it's basically, he turns him into a chump block or die kind of territory. And as the game goes on, we make additional land drops, because we will be drawing additional cards every turn from our treasures, from our Arch of Araska, things like that. We will be making our land drops quite consistently, so Squee gets progressively more and more effective as the game goes on, and it becomes harder enough for our opponent to remove all of this. So they basically have to attack Black Blade, and if they're doing that, then they're not attacking our legends, which is sweet. So, another fun little combo with Squee, we have Tormenting Voice, 1 and a red. This is another form of card advantage for us, however, it's kind of card disadvantage in a way, unless you use it correctly. Sorcery speed 2 mana, as an additional cost to cast this spell, discard a card, and then draw 2 cards. So you're basically replacing 2 cards with 2 cards, unless, of course, you actually discard Squee. Because Squee can be cast from the graveyard, it really doesn't matter that you're discarding Squee there, so it's a free discard, which basically turns this one into a 2 mana divination at that point, which is pretty cool. It's not the most overpowered combo in the world, but it's very useful all the same. So we can also use Tormenting Voice to discard our additional legends, because of course the legend rule applies. We can't play 2 Squees on board at the same time. Same goes for Lannery Storm, Lyras, everything of that nature. So if we feel like our legend is going to stick around for quite some time, then we might as well just discard that card anyway, because it's useless to us to begin with. So might as well dump our additional legendaries if we have them. So Tormenting Voice does have its abilities there. You know, the card disadvantage that could be seen there isn't always the terrible thing, because it's just either additional lands, Squeeze, or additional legendaries. So either way, we're getting our value out of this card. I quite like this. The removal is basically 2 Lava Coils, 1 and a red for a sorcery speed, good for the Golgari mid-range decks, deals 4 damage to a creature, which kills most of their creatures, and if that creature would die, it gets exiled instead, which means those Find Finalities, those Eldest Reborns, have less targets to actually interact with. So Lava Coil, really good at removing our opponent's stuff from the graveyard. We have 3 copies of Justice Strike as well. I've debated 4 on this one, but I think the 3-2 split with Lava Coil is doing me just fine, so no worries there. Red and a white, instant speed. Target creature deals damage to itself equal to its power. So, if it is a 6/6, if it is a 50/50, it's going to die to Justice Strike. The only exception where Justice Strike will not kill them is when their power is lower than their toughness, and then we have to probably combine it with either like a Deafening Clarion or a Lava Coil, something along those lines. So this actually hits the vast majority of things in the format right now, which is why I'm running this over the Lava Coils. It just allows us to hit much bigger things as well. So we can hit their Niv Mizzets, we can hit their Doom Whisperers, anything of that sort we can get rid of. And most stuff that actually has a power less than its toughness is actually within Lava Coil range as well, so we don't have too much to worry in that regard. As I mentioned, we are running 3 copies of Deafening Clarion because we do need that early game pressure being removed from our opponent. So 1 a red and a white for a sorcery speed board wipe. It deals 3 damage to each creature, which kills a hell of a lot of stuff. This is in here for basically the mono reds, the Boros decks, all of those aggro lists. Most of them have creatures that are 3 toughness or less, so this is basically a wonderful little board wipe. It does hit, of course, our Captain Lannery Storms and our Danathers, and even our Squees, but if it hits our Squee, who cares, because he's coming back. But the main thing that we want to make a note of with the Deafening Clarion is it actually has a wonderful little combo with Blackblade Reforged, because Blackblade Reforged obviously will take whatever creature it's equipped to out of the board wipe range. But in addition to doing all of that, we don't even need to use Deafening Clarion as a board wipe, because it has an additional ability here. It says creatures you control gain lifelink until the end of the turn. So what we can do is we can wipe our opponent's board with that 3 damage if we want. And then with something like our equipped Squee, who doesn't have lifelink, we can give him lifelink with Deafening Clarion, which means we might be even swinging over to our opponent with 11 lifelink damage, which is a huge power swing in our favour. So really good stuff. And obviously the board wipe could actually mean that we're either forcing our opponent to jump with a bigger threat, or we're just getting that 22-point life swing, let's just say. It just basically makes sure that they don't have any cannon fodder to just put in the way of Squee, and they start getting into really bad value chump block territory. So Tokens doesn't really have a game against Squee with a Black Blade equipped in that sense. We have 2 copies of Shalai as well as another legend. Really nice stuff here. We want to be protecting some of our lower to the ground creatures. So she allows us to do that. She's a 4-mana 3/4 flyer, so decent stats. She does die to Lava Coil, unfortunately, which is kind of prevalent in the format. But we can potentially use her +1/+1 counter ability that you see at the bottom there. 4 and 2 green, we can generate those 2 greens using our treasures, but we can also use Lannery Storm to generate treasures as well, so something to keep in mind. I often have 2 or 3 treasures hanging around when Shalai is coming down, so we can actually use her ability to actually put a counter on every creature we control, which would put her out of Lava Coil range, and that's quite important, because if we're playing against a deck like Burn, they basically can't deal with Shalai without getting a 2-for-1 deal, which is wonderful for us, because you planeswalkers you control and other planeswalkers you control have hexproof, so we can't be targeted, and Shalai is the only thing that can be targeted. So if she is out of range of 1 burn spell, then it is a 2-for-1 at that point. And maybe our opponent's been firing burn spells at our face up until that point, and they're quite empty-handed, which they might not even have 2 spells to take out Shalai at that stage, so really powerful stuff. We have 2 copies of Lyra Dawnbringer that combos with Shalai quite well as well. 5 mana for a 5/5 flying, first striking lifelink, and it gives other angels you control +1/+1 and lifelink, which puts Shalai out of Lava Coil range. It puts her to a 4/5 with lifelink. So really good stuff there. This is basically our burn killer right here. All we have to do is survive to that point, so we probably need to find either some of our Lava Coils and Justice Strikes or our Deafening Clarions just to survive long enough to get here. But once we're here, the game is probably over for burn, which is wonderful. Which means we have game against aggro. We also have game against control, because Squee is impossible to deal with. So not too many problems there at all. We actually have game against most stuff. This is kind of a mid-range deck, which is kind of how they run. They don't build a deck to beat one type of deck. They try to build a deck that beats all of them. It doesn't beat them terribly effectively, which means it's a very good sideboard deck. This should be noted. It actually does reasonably well in best of 1, though I would play this as a best of 3 deck if I were you, because it is a mid-range deck, and mid-range traditionally gets better in the sideboard. We basically shore up our bad matchups in our sideboard, so something to be aware of. If you're going to play this in best of 1, you probably want to put some sideboard cards in here, but we'll get to that soon enough. Anyway, on to our legendary sorceries. We've kind of touched upon these, but we've not really discussed them. 5 mana for our board wipe. Running 2 copies of this one. Exile all non-land permanents that are not legendary. So, this allows us to have a one-sided board wipe. Not only is it a one-sided board wipe, but it also allows us to release things from underneath. Sealaways, Ixalan's bindings, so Squee comes back. We can get things out of Conclave Tribunals, we can do all sorts of stuff. It's not always the most powerful card. If we are up against control, as I mentioned, we want to shore up our bad matchups. Urza's Ruinous Blast is bad against control because all of their finishers are legendary, so this wouldn't do anything in game 1. We do have a replacement effect for this in the sideboard though, and I will get to that soon enough, but I think the power of running Urza's Ruinous Blast is not to be underestimated. The amount of times this card on its own has won me a game is unreasonable. It's pretty sweet. I love this card so much. So, what we do is basically we get down our Squee, which makes it very castable. If our opponent kills Squee, we play Squee again until Urza's Ruinous Blast is castable, and then we wipe our opponent's board. We also have Jaya's Immolating Inferno. This is our equivalent of Banefire or Expansion Explosion, but it is in a legendary sorcery shell. Now, this card is actually... I thought it was going to be mediocre, but this card is superb, honestly. Double red and an X for X dealing damage to each of up to 3 targets. So we can target our opponent's face, we can target creatures, and we can target planeswalkers. Which actually means this can be a board wipe in itself as well. Yet again, as I mentioned, we'll have Squee coming down, but I think the main combo with Jaya is actually the Lannery Storm. Because she's generating treasures per turn, it allows us to up that X count over and over and over again. And if we're upping that X count using treasures, Lannery Storm is also going to get +1/+0 for each sacrificed treasure. I didn't really touch upon that actually when I was talking about Lannery Storm, but cracking treasures with Treasure Cove also triggers that effect. Sacrificing them for mana is the main way to do it. But we can actually use Jaya's Immolating Inferno with those treasures in combination to do some extreme amount of damage and then swing through with whatever Lannery Storm ends up being for some disgusting damage. So that's essentially the main deck. We're going to move on to the lands. We've got 7 plains and 8 mountains. We skew slightly more into red. The late game has a double white, but that's about it. So we really want to make sure that we have our Squee on turn 3. So we have 8 mountains over the 7 plains. Other than that, it's fairly even. We have 4 copies of Clifftop Retreat. Comes into play tapped unless you control a mountain or a plains. Sacred Foundry comes into play tapped unless you pay 2 life. It also counts as a mountain or a plains. So Clifftop Retreat is a turn 2 untapped land. So we'll have both double red and double white on turn 2. Very powerful stuff when we're thinking about getting Squee down on turn 3, but also having stuff like Deafening Clarion open. Really important right there. And finally, Arch of Araska. I contemplated having 2 of these in the deck, honestly, but I think it's probably for the best that you don't, just because of the turn 3 Squee that we kind of really need most of the time. So the Ascend allows us to pay 5 and draw a card with this one. So the City's Blessing is something that can only be activated when you have 10 or more permanents on the battlefield. Once you have it though, you're keeping it. So the way we go about flipping this one, it's very easy for us. It's either Lannery Storm generating tokens or Treasure Map most of the time. Treasure Map usually lines up perfectly with an Arch of Araska because of the treasures that are generating. That's 3 extra permanents on the field, and of course Treasure Map flipping over into Treasure Cove is not a permanent leaving the battlefield, so we can often ramp our way up into an Arch and get a really early City's Blessing there. So on to the sideboard. We have many things. So as I mentioned, we're going to be shoring up some bad matchups and shoring up some good matchups as well. We want to make sure whatever we're going up against, we have a game against. So if we're talking aggro, we have 3 copies of Shivan Fire. Now the reason I'm running this over Shock is because this actually has some late game potential. So it is 1 red mana for a 2 damage to a creature. Shock would allow you to target a player, but I don't feel like the player targeting is necessarily important in a card that we're looking for here. So I'm running Shivan Fire instead because it also has an additional ability. We can kick it to make it a 5 mana removal spell. and it turns it basically into Bad Lava Coil. And Bad Lava Coil is still a reasonable card. So we're running 3 copies of Shivan Fire for the early game, but also for late game potential as well. This could have some applications in like Golgari mid-range when we're hitting like Fine Brokers and things like that, but we also get to hit Jade Light Rangers and stuff of that nature. For the Golgari matchups, we do have more copies of Lava Coil. It's also in here for Drakes, because everyone knows I love Drakes. 1 and a red sorcery speed. Lava Coil deals 4 damage to a creature. Exile it. We know what this one does. It's basically our other 2 copies of Lava Coil we want to bring in. So if we want to make sure that our opponent's graveyard is pretty terrible, we want to bring this one in. For aggro as well, we have Deafening Clarion as our 4th card, because as I mentioned earlier, we want to be hitting this Clarion so that we can have an empty board for our Shalai and Lyras to come down into a burn matchup. So the 4th one just makes sure that we are more likely to hit that on time. Now we have 2 copies of Ixalan's Binding, and this one might seem a little odd at first because we're running Urza's Ruinous Blast, and Urza's Ruinous Blast destroys Ixalan's Binding. The reason why we're running Ixalan's Binding is actually because it's here for a control matchup. As I mentioned, Ruinous Blast is terrible against things like Jeskai Control, so we'll be bringing it out. What we'll do instead is we'll actually bring in 2 copies of Ixalan's Binding, so there isn't actually anything for in our deck that would kill our Binding on our own. So we get to run this wonderful card that deals with control matchups. 3 and a white enchantment. Enters the battlefield, you exile a non-land permanent an opponent controls until Ixalan's Binding leaves the battlefield, and your opponents can't cast spells with the same name as the exiled card. So we can target Squee if our opponent's playing the mirror, but most of the time we want to be targeting Teferis and Niv Mizzets. That's basically Jeskai Control's only win cons. We then have the Drakes to contend with, but we just have the Justice Strikes. We leave those in there because they usually bring in Lyras as well. So we bring in leaving the Justice Strikes to take care of all the Phoenixes and the Lyras, and we bring in the Ixalan's Bindings to take care of the Teferis and the Niv Mizzets. On to another burn card as well. Forgot to mention this one. We have another 4 copies of Shalai, or is it 3 copies? It's 3 copies, isn't it? Yes, 3 copies. I used to have 4 copies in here, but I actually removed one to improve a little matchup. I ended up adding some Immortal Suns, so that's why I got tripped up on that one. But yes, 3rd copy for burn here as well. We also have 2 copies of the Immortal Sun. This is pretty good against the Golgari matchups because they usually run Vivian Reeds and Vraskas, both the 4 mana and the 6 mana ones, so there's plenty for this to hit. It's also superb anyway. 6 mana for a legendary artifact. Players can't activate Planeswalker loyalty abilities, so that shuts off Teferis, it shuts off Vraskas, it shuts off Vivian Reeds. So in the Golgari matchup, they only have Assassin's Trophy to deal with the Immortal Sun, which isn't the end of the world, because we'll probably also be bringing in Star of Extinctions, so it allows us to ramp into this as well, but we'll get to that in a second. Because there's a lot of things on the Immortal Sun that we have to get to. Now, the Immortal Sun also allows you to draw an additional card per turn, so it is kind of our additional treasure map card advantage kind of combo. So we'll be drawing 2 cards a turn, which keeps up with control, another way of getting that advantage. It's not just to take down Teferi here, it is also for superb card advantage, so they can't possibly have more counters than we have cards in hand. That's kind of the idea. It also has a bit of cost reduction. It's not going to be terribly noticeable most of the time, but nice cost reduction is just fine, you know. We can get Squee down for 2 mana and equip him for 3, so he becomes a 5 mana monster at that point, which is pretty sweet. And finally, creatures you control get +1/+1 as well, so gets our Shalai out of burn range for most stuff, but, you know, it's just going to be one of those things. It's mostly here to shut down Planeswalkers and for the additional card draw. The other 2 are just perks. So, as I mentioned, we have 2 copies of Star Extinction in here. 7 mana for a sorcery, easy enough to get to in this deck. It says destroy target land, so this is a reason why we're not running Field of Ruins, is because we actually have Star of Extinctions in our sideboard to deal with any lands like Azcanta, but for the most part it's actually in here as a board wipe. Star of Extinction deals 20 damage to each creature and each Planeswalker. Now it will wipe our board away, unfortunately, but our board hopefully has a Squee on it, so we don't care. Mostly it's in here to deal with very, very big boards, for when Deafening Clarion is a terrible board wipe, but we still need a board wipe. We do have, of course, our Ruinous Blasts and our Immolating Infernos to get the job done, but we can bring them in over the Deafening Clarions in a control matchup, so it's one of those get rid of a dead card, put in a useful card kind of situations. Yes, it's going to kill all of the Planeswalkers, nothing's going to survive this, and essentially every single creature's going to die as well. I'm sure there's a very fringe case where Star of Extinction doesn't kill a creature, but it's not really going to happen all that much. Finally, we got 2 copies of Banefire for the control matchups again. Red and an X for a sorcery speed. If the Jaya's Immolating Infernos are not going to do the job, because of course they can actually be countered, let's bring in a card that can't be countered. So it deals X damage to any target, and if X is 5 or more, this spell cannot be countered and the damage cannot be prevented. So what we do is we ramp up with our treasure maps and our Lannery Storms generating treasures, and we just make our land drops per turn, and eventually we just Banefire our opponent for lethal. So if our opponent is playing control and they're just using stall tactics, you know, they're just going land and go. If it's basically draw, go, control, it just buys us enough time to just make our land drops and get our win con going, because Lannery Storm will generate treasures. So we'll treasure map, and we've got 24 lands in here to make sure that we hit our lands on time. So Banefire, very easy to get that lethal kill in there. So that's going to be the deck anyway, guys. I hope you enjoy this list. It is super sweet and super fun, so be sure to check out the matches that we'll be following. At the end of this video, there'll be a link to that as well in the description below. There's also a deck list down there as well, so you can export it to Magic Arena yourself if you want to have some Squee fun. It is really good. I love this deck, and it's actually pretty competitive as well. It's no tier 1 deck, but it does stand up to a hell of a lot of stuff. You know, Control has a really hard time against Squee, so one of the fun parts about it. So anyway, guys, like and subscribe, hit that little bell icon, share this deck around if you think you know someone who might enjoy this deck, or you think it's awesome and you want to help out the channel. Sharing the video is the best way to go about doing that. Other than that though, thanks very much for watching, I hope you enjoy, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.